He had been in the Catskills since noon, chasing the last wet leaves and the way rain stitched silver across the shoulders of Route 28. Evan March preferred film when he could afford it. The job was for a magazine that swore it still valued contact sheets and darkroom grain. The promise of a landscape that looked like it could swallow a man whole if he lingered too long at the guardrail. November did the rest. Light went flat early, and by late afternoon the mountains looked poured from slate. His rental's defroster breathed on the glass like a tired animal. The radio dipped between stations and rose again in fragments. Weather advisories, auction notices, a hymn from a church in Kingston, never clear long enough to keep him company. He should have stopped in Phoenicia, maybe taken the cheap motel with the flickering vacancy sign and the office cat that guarded the coffee machine. But deadlines were a currency he never managed well. Another 10 miles, he told himself. One more barn, one more high meadow, one more photo that would persuade an editor with a red pencil to give him December, too. The rain thickened as he left the last town behind. The road he took out of habit was narrower than he remembered, a county route without guardrails where stone walls slouched under ferns and the trees knit together overhead. When the GPS lost its mind and spun the map like a bottle, he shut the screen off and drove the way his father taught him. Eyes reading the dark, hands steady, speed a quiet truce between fear and denial. He saw her where the shoulder widened to let two cars pass if one of them was generous. She stood in the cones of his headlights without flinching, white dress pasted to her knees, hair too dark to be only wet. Evan braked hard, anti-lock juddering under his boot, the car slewing before it straightened. For one beat, he only sat, wipers hammering, heart loud. The girl did not step back. He cracked the window. Rain pushed in sideways, cold enough to pinch his ear. "You okay?" he asked, which was a stupid question, but language had a way of failing when everything else was louder. Her face turned a little, pale, eyes big but not pleading. "I need a ride," she said. The voice carried through the rain as if she were closer than she was. "Home." He thumbed the lock. She was in the passenger seat before he could reach to open the door, which he filed under adrenaline tricks. The seat did not squeak. The smell that came with her was not wet wool and shampoo, but something cleaner and older, like the cold itself had a scent. He waited for the drip-drip of water off a coat, the messy trail that would make him think about damage fees, and felt stupid when it did not come. "Where's home?" he asked. "Hollow Creek." She folded her hands in her lap with a carefulness that felt learned, a habit that outlived whoever taught it. "I'll tell you where to turn. I'm Evan." A beat passed, not quite silence. Wipers, engine, the soft hiss of rain against glass, but it had the weight of someone considering if the question required a name in return. "Emily," she said, and if the syllables were a lie, they were a kind that refused to apologize. They moved. The heater worked harder. The temperature in the cabin did not notice. He tried small talk out of reflex, and because the quiet pressed. Weather, school, if she needed a blanket from the back. She answered in a way that suggested she knew the shape of an answer, but not the softness people used when they were just giving you their breath to be kind. When he glanced at her hands at a long bend, he saw the nails were clean and blunt, the knuckles almost colorless. The dress had long sleeves with buttons at the wrist, the kind you had to ask someone else to fasten if you were rushed. It was too old-fashioned for a party, too plain for a costume, too dignified for anything young people wore on a night that had bars and music in it. The radio found a station clean enough to hold for 2 minutes. A voice recited closures and flood advisories, then a list of lost pets. In the middle of a lab named Clover and a tomcat with one torn ear, the signal cut to snow and a low mechanical rhythm like a relay switching in an empty room. Evan tapped the dial once, twice. The rhythm did not change. Emily's head tilted, listening, and the back of his neck cooled. "Turn right," she said, and he did. The county road was unmarked on his map app, but the tires knew it, or maybe the ruts asked you not to think. Houses thinned. Stone chimneys leaned. Mailboxes had hand-painted names and no lights in the window behind them. He looked for porch lamps and dogs. He saw none. At the first stop sign in 5 miles, someone had hammered a wooden placard to the post below the red octagon. It had been painted white a long time ago. Now weather and boredom had peeled it back to the grain. In black marker, a tidy hand had lettered 9 short lines. "Do not stop if you see her in the rain. If you already stopped, She sits on the passenger side. Keep moving. If headlights tail you, do not pull over. Do not look for her reflection in the rear view. Do not touch her hands. She will be cold enough to burn. If she hums, listen for the road that is not on any map. If she points, turn. If she says faster, obey. When the radio clicks like a clock in an empty house, count to 7. Do not try to take her home until she tells you she remembers the way. Evan read them with his foot on the brake and felt ridiculous because folklore came stapled to diners and high school legends, not to municipal hardware. Emily read them without moving. When he looked at her, she looked not embarrassed and not amused, but like someone seeing an old photograph of a thing that used to be on the fridge. Joke, he tried. Rules, she said. No smile. If anything, a small relief that he had seen them at all. Now go. He went. The tires pulled water behind them like quiet stitches. He told himself somebody with a salt truck and a sense of humor had fought boredom the way people do. He told himself if there were rules posted, then other drivers had seen this girl, and the county had found a ritual to keep them from killing each other at the one-stop hamlet where the road narrowed to one lane at the bridge. He told himself a dozen efficient lies about infrastructure, because the alternative was to accept that the air around his wrists was getting colder by degrees that ignored the dashboard, and his breath misted once when he laughed to prove it wasn't. How far to Hollow Creek, he asked. When we're nearer, she said, evasive as a child and patient as a calendar. Headlights appeared behind them at a curve shaped like a crooked finger. In his mirror, the lights were too high, too bright. He checked his speed. 45. Not insultingly slow. The headlights closed the gap as if the wet demanded speed, and the driver agreed. Evan considered pulling off the shoulder to let them by, but there wasn't a shoulder anymore, only ditch. The rules hung behind his eyes anyway. Keep moving. If headlights tail you, do not pull over. The car behind them blinked high beams in the kind of rhythm that was not a request. Emily's posture changed without a sound. Not a flinch, not a panic, just a long, tight readiness that belonged to a different century. Faster, she said. Road's not great. Faster. She did not turn to look at him. She watched the dark ahead as if she could measure it. Please. He added 5 miles per hour. The car behind them added 10. The distance between them did not change. He could feel the pressure of those lights on the dark like a thumb grinding into a bruise. When the beams hit the rear view just right, the cabin filled with clean white paint. He tilted the mirror down to save his eyes and saw his mouth in it, thinner than he meant it to be. Who is that? He said. It came out more annoyed than he felt. Anger was a tool when fear made bad decisions sound clever. The one who won't let me arrive, Emily said, and if there was grief in it, it had been sitting in the same chair for decades and had learned not to sob. The first bump came like an argument. Not the big shove of a truck. Something with weight, but hesitancy kissed the rental's bumper and let go. Evan's hands locked on the wheel. The second bump was bolder, the kind that makes tires think about their contracts with water. His bag slid on the back seat, lenses thudding into one another soft as eggs. Okay, he said, mostly to himself and a little to the road. He took a long curve with more speed than he admired and kept it anyway because the rules liked forward motion. Emily's humming began low, a shape more than a tune. It made him think of a clock wound by a nervous ant. He realized it matched the relay click noise the radio fell into when a station slipped out from under the needle. The hair at his wrist stood, a small field leaning with static. Left, she said, and the lane to the left did not exist. There was a gap in the stone wall wide enough for a county truck to pull in, a track indenting the grass where tires had convinced the meadow to be path. He took it because there was no other reason to number rules with ink if you weren't going to use them when they cost you something. The car behind them surged past in a blur of wet, and then braked too late, red flares swelling and shrinking in the mirrors before the sedan slewed and corrected and shot away, horn long and hurt. The track Emily had chosen became a narrow tarmac 2 bends later, the kind of lane people forgot when winter calendars were printed. Evan looked at Emily, then the mirror, then the rear glass, saw no one. His hands began to unknot one tendon at a time. The cold did not lift. If anything, it pressed in, an intelligence without breath. Who won't let you arrive? He asked. She watched the wipers scrape and return. He is older now. That explains nothing. Once he was 23 and thought he could decide when a night ended. Rules apply to the living until the living decide they do not. She turned her head. The pupils were big, a black you could imagine falling into, and something behind them did not reflect the light back the way eyes learned to do when they were small. You should know the rules. I read the sign. Those are the ones for drivers who are surprised. Her mouth made a shape that was not sarcasm, not pity, something like instruction. There were rules for me first. She named them as if she were reciting an address to a desk clerk tired of hearing it mispronounced. Do not cut across the marsh when the fog drops before supper. If a stranger calls from the lane and you cannot see his face, do not answer from the porch. If you hear a car humming long before you see its lights, step back from the wall. Do not lift your hand for a ride unless you already know the driver's name. If you are late, tell your mother before the radio turns to snow. If you are alone, do not sing the tune, you only sing when you are happy. If you must walk, keep your hands in your pockets so you will not wave. He drove with the careful politeness of a man entering a chapel he did not belong to. The lane downgraded to gravel. The trees shouldered the wet and gave nothing back. When they came to AT, Emily pointed right. When they approached a culvert too narrow for two, she made a small impatient sound that meant faster. At the first mailbox he had seen in 15 minutes, a small rectangle of wood screwed to the post held a faded name burned into it with a hot nail. Wyatt. Family, he asked. She did not nod. She did not smile. She did not say yes the way a person does when you have guessed a thing too obvious to mark. She only set her right hand flat on her knee as if it might lift if she let it think, and he understood the gesture had nothing to do with modesty and everything to do with a promise she had once made to herself. They found the farmhouse not by seeing it, but by noticing where the night was thicker. The porch roof had buckled years ago. The board still learned how to be a porch every spring and then forgot. The barn sat 30 yards beyond, a tall dark shape that leaned from the wind as if listening. Evan pulled into the yard and killed the engine because that was what you do when you are the kind of person who returns a rental without extra charges. The absence of the engine's hum made the rain sound like a clock again. Stay here, he said, and immediately understood the absurdity of telling a presence to remain seated in a car designed to protect the living from weather and paperwork. He got out anyway. The rain touched his face like a relative who knew too much. The barn doors did not complain when he pushed. Inside smelled like old hay and mouse paper. His flashlight found dust and a shoulder-high hill of debris where someone had swept with efficiency 5 months ago and then stopped caring. Against the far wall, as if a catalog had spilled and arranged itself by theme, newspaper clippings ran shoulder to shoulder. He stepped closer and his light named them for him. Girl struck on County Road. Local man charged. Vigil marks 10th year. Son changes name. Prison death. The photos were all of the same 3 images. A road where the pavement darkened with rain, a school portrait of a girl with long hair parted in the middle, and a man in a suit standing too straight because no one had told him how to hold his grief in court. A door laid across cinder blocks made a desk. On it a notebook lay open, paper bubbled from damp, ink seeping where the line had been pressed too hard in anger. Evan did not touch it. He read where it sat, because there are rules about reading what is not yours, and you can only break so many in an hour before the night keeps score. November 15th. He read it once, then felt his mouth move to count the year, then found more years stacked like wood behind it. He did not need all of them. The first one taught the shape of the wound. I thought I could make him laugh. He wanted to go home. I put my hand on the wheel because he wouldn't. She stepped out. It was only a second. It was only the width of a dress. It was only, the handwriting broke. Picked up 3 lines down. Daniel said we should turn back. I didn't. I don't know why I didn't. The buzzing in my ears was the radio, or God. She felt like a light going out. He skimmed, then forced himself not to skim when a man's cowardice tried to dress itself as speed. I lied, it said later. I said I'd been dropped off. I said I was home by midnight. I let my cousin keep the rest. When the verdict came back, I stood like a man in a photograph and thought if I didn't move, the world would put me back where I belonged. November comes, and she does, too. Every year, she asks me to drive. Every year, I pretend the wheel is mine. Every year, she shows me the wall. Back away from the desk. The voice was not the radio's. Evan lifted his hands and turned his head in a slow increment he hoped looked civilized. New York State Police filled a narrow triangle of space with a woman's calm and a man's habit of standing where he could see every window. Hi, Evan said, Because there are stranger openings. I called 911 when someone tried to run us off the road. He had not. But the lie felt like a way to make the night think it was linear again. He nodded toward the desk. You're going to want this notebook. The troopers' names rode their breast pockets. Ortega and Hale. Ortega's eyes moved, noting, measuring, filing. Hale's light ran the wall, catching staples, the torn half-moons where clippings had been rehung too many times. Who is U.S.? Ortega asked. Evan's mouth was dry enough to make a sound scrape. A girl, he said. Emily. He realized the name may not help. White dress. Hale's light stopped. Ortega's did not. They had a conversation with their faces that did not require words. Then Ortega cleared her throat the way people do when they will say a thing that might detonate someone else's life if they drop it too fast. There have been reports on this date, she said. Over the years. Rules posted at a stop sign. Evan said, which was either evidence or his brain manufacturing folklore in self-defense. Hale's radio muttered, then crackled clean long enough for a dispatcher to drop a slice of something official. Abandoned sedan registered to a rental at LaGuardia, engine warm, driver on foot heading north from County 12 near the Wyatt property. The name the rental pulled through a shard of ice into a pool that had already skimmed over. Russell Keene. Ortega's get on with it changed angles by a degree you feel more than see. Stay by the door, she told Evan. If you hear me say move, move. She nodded at Hale, and he angled toward the ladder to the loft with the caution of a man who has seen barns do more than hold hay. Evan took one step back because a command in that tone borrows authority from childhood. He glanced into the yard, half to check if Emily sat as he had instructed and half because the cold had sharpened again like a blade laid flat against his ribs. She stood not by the car but near the stone wall, her dress a pale flag in rain that now fell softly as ash. She raised one arm and pointed. Not at the troopers, not at the desk, not at the door, but at the gap in the loft rail where someone had lost a board long ago and never fixed it because ladders are easier than the thing they fix. Hale's foot hit the second from the top rung, and the barn made a small noise the way old buildings do when they consider whether to be kind. A boot scuffed on the loft floor. Ortega said, "State Police," with a steadiness that could freeze a pond. A man answered with breathing and the kind of silence that tries to pick which way to run. "Hands," Hale said. "Let me see them now." "Don't shoot," the man said, and the way he said it told Evan this was not a man who had practiced fear out loud. He stepped into the shaft of the flashlight as if he were a photograph, not tall and not strong, but a frame held together by wire and nervous electricity. His beard was a month past honest. His eyes were a man who had laid a child down in the grass once and then never told himself the truth about why he'd done it. "Down," Ortega said. "Take the ladder slow." He started, then stopped when a second figure moved in the dark at the loft's far end. Evan saw the knife because that is the one thing night always volunteers if it must. The man at the far rail had the posture of a person who had not planned to do this tonight, but had planned to do it eventually and rehearsed until his muscles could recite. "Don't," Ortega said, and in the space after it the barn drew one long breath that belonged to nobody living. "My father died in Attica," the second man said, and his voice was not the voice of a boy, but the one a boy wears for the courtroom that took his last surname away. "My father died," and this man kept his mouth shut because secrets are warmer than truth. The knife stayed canted, not dramatic and not sloppy. The hand that held it shook without moving. "Say his name." The first man, the one the rental favored, opened and closed his mouth like he had learned to breathe in a heavier air. "Michael," he said, and if the sound had a last name attached, it did not fit through his teeth. "Michael Hargrove." "And yours," Ortega said, because reintroductions are a way to take the heat out of a room without opening a window. "Russell Keene," the man said, and Evan saw the name settle across the notebook on the desk like soot. "Knife on the floor," Hale said, the simple math of inches and arteries carving every letter. The second man lowered the blade. Emily's hand at the wall did not drop. The radio clicked behind Hale, two crisp ticks like the heart of a machine. Evan found himself counting without deciding to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When the seventh beat passed, the cold loosened its hand just enough for the air to move. Emily walked through the barn doors with a grace that was not learned from dance, but from decades of having to be careful with any matter that resisted. Ortega's light found her and did not pass through her. Hale's breath marked the air. Russell saw her and did not say don't shoot a second time because his language was occupied. Emily Wyatt, the second man, the son, said with the reverence of someone who has been told a name every night before bed for 30 years. You came. I get to arrive when the road remembers, Emily said. She looked at Russell, then at the knife on the floor, then at the desk where his years bled through paper. Tell them. Russell made a sound that did not know whether it wanted to be words or air. I was a kid, he said finally, and the barn did not accept it because the last sentence was older than any of them. We had been drinking. Not enough to make me court-martial drunk. Enough to call it a different night. Daniel said we should stop. He said don't. He said wait. He said, he swallowed. I wanted to scare her. I wanted to laugh the way boys laugh when they stand in the mirror and don't look themselves in the eyes. He closed his own eyes now. The wheel has weight when someone else has to pay for what it does. And when it ended? Ortega asked, voice thin as tin and honest as a ledger. After. I lied. The word did not pretend to be brave. I lied to the police. I lied to a prosecutor who wanted a clean story. I lied to a jury that wanted a man they could point to and say that's what went wrong. I lied to my cousin's son when he asked me why, and I told him not to ask that in this house. Russell shook with a careful restraint that belonged to men who do not cry in front of officers because that would mean something about them they learned young. I came here every year because not coming hurt worse. She makes me drive. She takes my hands. She makes me look. Emily did not flinch at her own power described. She stepped close enough to Russell that the rain on her dress did not wet his shirt. She lifted one hand the way a mother checks a child's temperature in the night and set it against his cheek. He made a sound like a branch surrendering under snow. I remember, she said, and Evan understood it was both verdict and mercy. You will tell them all of it. And you will tell the boy who carries a name he had to change. She looked past Russell to the second man, who stood with his empty hands open, breathing like a man who had run through 3 decades without stopping. No more knives. The knife lay dull on the boards. Hale towed it away and slid it under a hay hook as if this were any other call. Ortega spoke into her radio and made words into procedures into a world that citizens agree exists so they can sleep. In the doorway the rain let up and the long-grayed hum of the creek swelled a little, a sound like tape unspooling when a machine is done with it. I have a picture, Evan heard himself say, and did not know why it mattered to say it here, except that proof at the wrong time is how men lose their minds. From the road before we saw you. When the shutter was too slow and there was rain on the lens. You were there at the edge. Emily turned. Not startled. Not vain. She tilted her head as if she were hearing a hymn from behind a closed door. Develop it, she said. Give it to his aunt. She looked at the son, the man who had climbed the loft with a knife and a last name like a bruise. And you, Liam Hargrove, you will stand at your father's stone and say the words you have never said out loud. He breathed once in a way that shook him and nodded. The nod was small, but it held. Ortega's cruiser lights washed the yard, red then blue, blue then red, painting the boards and the rain and Evan's hands in turn. When he looked again at the gap in the loft rail, he saw only night. They took Russell out with his wrists obedient, a man who had finally met a story he could not rehearse without breaking it. The notebook went into a bag. Hale called for another unit. Ortega walked Evan through his statement with the patience of a nurse and the exactness of a metronome. Do not drive tonight, she said when it was done. We will get you to town. I can manage, he started, because independence is a habit that grows like a weed in men who work alone, and stopped when the cold drew its finger down his spine and left him without the kind of pride that makes you lie to yourself. At the Hollow Creek station, the forms were warmer than the room. Ortega left him with coffee that tasted like work and a blanket that might have been folded last in 1999. Dawn thought about it and then decided to wait. Rain quieted to a lace. We've got to call in to the DA, Hale said when he came back. It'll move. Might take longer than you think. Might go faster than anyone deserves. Either way, the paper keeps the truth if we do the steps. He set a business card on the table with a pen that had the kind of heft you don't steal by accident. Don't leave town until we say. If you do, tell us first. I live in the city, Evan said. I can come back. You will, Hale said, and not as a threat. By noon, the rain burned off enough that the road shed water in seams. Ortega drove him to a motel that had been careful with its towels for 3 decades. He slept in a thin afternoon and woke to the sound of an ice machine chewing its own heart in the corridor. The cold was gone in the way a fever leaves you. What remains is your own temperature reclaimed and a fatigue that sits on the bed like an old friend who forgot your birthday. He went home the next day by a route that chose convenience over art. In his apartment in Queens, he let the city's steady noise teach him what to do next. He worked in the dark because the light outside was too clean to tell a story like this. The negative took shape under his hands exactly the way a small, stubborn part of him had hoped it would not and been certain that it would. Frame 31. Road wet as a wound. Headlights that belonged to him. On the shoulder, a smear that was not dust or a trick of the enlarger, but a figure with hair that refused the light and a dress that remembered the old word for white. He made 3 prints. 2 went into a folder he labeled with a date and nothing else. The third went into a stiff envelope he addressed to Janet Hargrove, care of Ortega, Hollow Creek Station. He wrote a note that did not try to explain the black border and did not apologize to the laws of physics for what they had allowed to happen in his presence. He said only what was true. I saw her. She asked me to send you this. He did not expect a reply and did not need one, which is a good way to live if you care about survival. But late the next week, a card arrived with an old woman's script and a force that made his eyes go hot. Daniel was my brother, it said. We always thought the truth would find its way home if we left a light on. Thank you for turning the lamp up. There was no return address. There did not need to be. He called Ortega. Anything? He asked, which was a bad reporter's question and a good man's cry. It moves, she said. Keene signed. The DA is hunting precedent and paper trails. There will be a hearing. It won't undo a prison death. It will say the word vacate in a courtroom, and the room will feel different when it does. She paused. He hasn't come back. The driver? The rules, she said, as if that were a single thing. Not this year. November 15th passed without a call. She breathed in a way that might have been relief and might have been something you only allow yourself on the phone, not in the office. I don't think she needed to walk in the rain anymore. Evan slept hard that night. When he dreamed, it was not of impact or glass. It was of the radio's relay that became a metronome, 2 clean clicks counting 7 and then releasing the air. In the morning, his prints were dry. He slipped one into a portfolio because the magazine would want the mountain and the fence and the lone maple in a field that looked like a calendar page. He considered taking the road to Hollow Creek on his way to the city desk that would pay him less than the train did for delays. He did not go. There are rules about re-entering a story after it has found its ending. A month later, snow came thin and early, the honest kind that melts on your sleeve and doesn't lie about staying. He walked the long block to the bodega and bought milk and a paper. On the bottom half of the B section, a photograph sat that was not his, a file image by a staffer who did not believe in ghosts, but believed in the way a courthouse door looks when it opens on a family. Hargrove conviction vacated, the headline said. Below, cites new evidence, witness admission. In the photo, a man who could have been Liam shook a lawyer's hand without smiling. Off to the side, a woman with hair the color of smoke looked up and away from the camera, as if someone had said her name very softly from a long distance, and she wanted to hear it better before she turned. He touched the edge of the newsprint and felt the thin grit that ink leaves. In the laundromat across the street, 4 machines turn with the patient, tidal thunk that tells you your clothes will remember your shape. He found himself humming without intending to, a low, tuneless thing the body uses when it wants to measure a room. He stopped when he noticed and smiled, not because the sound frightened him, but because it didn't. That night, the city's hum wandered. In the gap between 2 broadcast towers, the radio on his shelf dropped its station and fell onto the relay again. Click, click, a heartbeat for a room with nobody in it. Evan counted 7 and waited for the cold that did not come. He went to the window. Snow fell without deciding whether to stick. Down on the street, a woman walked a dog in a blue coat. Somebody laughed too hard at a joke on their phone and then apologized to the person on the other end, though neither of them could hear. He left the radio where it was and let the metronome count time for a few minutes. Because rules do not only tell you what to fear, sometimes they teach you where to put your hands when the night is bigger than you are. On a shelf to the left of the enlarger, a print dried. A road, a dress, a figure waiting at the exact place where the shoulder widened and the wall dropped away. If he looked long enough, he could pretend the white at the hem was lace and not light. If he stepped back, the image became only rain and the stain of headlights. He turned off the safe light, and the room surrendered to a darkness that did not mind being named. He stood there until he could hear the radio again, small and faithful as a clock in an empty house. And when the seventh click came, he smiled and turned the dial the way a person closes a book at the exact sentence where the author meant them to stop. Outside, somewhere north where the road curves and the stone wall is older than anyone who leans on it, a barn sighed as winter arranged itself along its beams. In the field beyond it, the grass lay down and made the sound grass makes. The rules stayed nailed to the stop sign, ink fading the way ink does, and the hand that wrote them did not come back to trace the letters. You could drive that way in a storm now and miss the board if you were thinking about your own life too hard. But some nights a voice on a weak station would lose its place, and a relay would click in a dark room, and a driver with their hands correct and their eyes kind would feel, just for a breath, the air leaned colder around the passenger seat, as if memory itself had climbed in to make sure that arrival, once earned, does not get lost again.
If you love chilling horror stories and eerie mysteries, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us every week for a new descent into darkness. Your next nightmare is just one click away.